sector, in the public sector, and continued to do so in the nonprofit world. He has extensive experience in board recruitment, in executive director recruitment and hiring. He has served as the board, a staff leader, and a board member, a board chair and board member for many, many organizations. And, you know, my experience is that anybody who has ended up with David on their board, especially as board chair, has considered themselves extremely fortunate. His bio is included in the invitation you received, so I won't go into details there. Suffice it to say, he is a great deal of wisdom in this arena. So I hope you will ask questions. We will leave time at the end. If you have additional questions, this is a great chance to ask them. David, to you.
Thank you, Margo. Let me take a moment and just comment that Margo, in my opinion, is probably one of the most knowledgeable people that I know in this whole area of board management. And during the course of this conversation, there may be areas where Margo and I disagree. My recommendation would be take Margo's advice. But let's begin. I'm going to take a few minutes and read something that I've written, just because I think it'll sort of set the tone for what we're talking about, and will give us a chance, sort of a foundation for the conversation going forward. This is a timely conversation, given the strains under which many nonprofit organizations are now operating. Being successful over time depends upon two key factors: understanding and trust. Our comments today will focus primarily on the relationship between an executive director and the chair of the board of the organization. But much of what we will be discussing also applies to staff and the board in general. Let's start with understanding. It is critical that the executive director and the board share a thorough understanding of the organization, its history, its mission, and its goals, its administrative structure, and importantly, its finances. If there are gaps in the understanding, they need to be filled. I've spent a lot of time working with bankers, not something I would particularly recommend, but the thing I've learned is to follow the money. It's important to understand the organization's finances, the organization's budget, the sources and the security of the funding, and the expectation of its funders. As to trust, it's critical but not given in this situation. It begins with articulating expectations. As board chair, I've always told the executive director, 1, don't pretend to know something that you don't. Number 2, never lie to me, by omission or by commission. 3, you can ask me any question about any subject, no exceptions, and I'll try to give you an honest answer. And the last is write a weekly update on activities and issues, which never happens. I wish it would, but it's not, it's sort of something that it's difficult to get into the habit of. As board chair, taking that side, because I've filled both roles here, I try to work from consensus. It's important to keep good minutes, and from my point of view, to sort of set Robert's rules of order aside. As a director, I expect frequent and honest feedback from the board chair, and of the chair, I ask that they not pretend to know something they don't, that they never lie to me. And that they understand that they can ask me any question on any subject. The relationship between a board chair and an executive director is unequal. The board chair is instrumental at hiring and firing directors, and the director has a detailed understanding of all aspects of the organization that will exceed that of the board chair. The power of each position needs to be understood and acknowledged. It's difficult for me to imagine a more challenging job than that of the executive director of a social service organization. There's never enough time or money, and the need seems to be infinite. Building a rocket to Mars is a piece of cake compared to meeting the needs of the underserved. For several years, I was chair of the board of a local housing authority. I worked in the area providing affordable housing for much of my life, but it wasn't until I got a close look at a housing authority that I began to really understand the depth and complexity of the need and the difficulty of meeting that need. When I was a boy growing up in Western New York State, the circus came to a nearby city every year. After putting up the tent, they organized a parade down the main street of the town. The parade always ended with the elephants, and following the elephants was a person with a shovel. Think of that person with a shovel as the executive director of a nonprofit agency. If someone agrees to become the chair of a board of a nonprofit, they must be willing to put in the time to fully understand and support the agency. People who join a board should be chosen for their commitment to the mission of the agency, but also of equal importance is the need for the skill they have, the skill that they bring. Everyone needs a job that is well-defined and embraced. The worst thing that can happen on a board is to have people who don't know why they're there. So this is a discussion that relies a lot on the idea of the relationship between the executive director and the chair of the board. And it's an area where there aren't necessarily clear lines. It's something that has to be understood within each context. And it takes time and commitment in order to do that. I'm curious, Margo, from your perspective, what you find is sort of the boundaries between those two positions.
Great question. And I suspect there are a number of people on this call who probably have experience with this as well. I think the critical nature is the concern I hear most commonly from executive directors is that the board gets into operations in an inappropriate way. The most common complaint I hear from board presidents is that the executive director doesn't share enough information or shares information at a point where there's nothing that the board is really expected or is able to do about it, that decisions have been made, projects have commenced, and the board wasn't brought in at an early enough stage for them to feel like they're part of the discussion and part of the decision making. So, the boundaries between governance and operations is a critical balance. And my sense is, as long as the board chair and the executive director have a good relationship, they can discuss that on a somewhat regular basis and just ask each other, how are we doing? How am I doing? And if you can develop that kind of relationship with the board chair, it benefits the entire board as well as the organization.
One of the things that I've seen particularly difficult for organizations, and it often stems from the fact that there is a good communication between the board chair and the executive director, is sub-channels that develop between board members and members of the staff, particularly when there's some concern about the direction of the organization. And it can be really very difficult and destructive to an organization. Not that you don't want a friendly, cooperative relationship between the board members and the larger staff, but it's really important to respect the administrative structure. And if there are problems that come up that people who are on the board see, then they have a responsibility of finding a way to bring that through the channels for discussion, but try to avoid back channels that sometimes get very problematic. So that's something you've seen on occasion.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the challenges executive directors often face is a change in board leadership, or an executive director is hired and it turns out that their predecessor had practices of more informal interaction between staff and board members, and it becomes a challenge for a new executive director. So it's something that needs to be. I mean, David talked in the beginning about trust, and honestly, if an executive director can work hard to develop a trusting relationship with the board chair and vice versa, the board chair really makes an effort to develop a trusting relationship, there's very few things that can't be discussed. When that relationship is not entirely successful, not working for either the board chair or the executive director, a lot of things can happen that neither would prefer to see happen. So I just can't emphasize the concept of trust any more than that.
Yeah, we had a question that came in earlier about what a board member should do if, in their estimation, the relationship between the board chair and the executive director is problematic. And I think it's a tricky question, that if somebody really believes that that's the case, then having a discussion with the two of them together might very well be a good thing to do. But on the other hand, interpersonal relations like that can be pretty difficult to carry out. And if that is the observation, and if the person doesn't feel confident in doing that, finding somebody who has some professional skills in this area in terms of facilitating that kind of relationship might be the best approach to take. It's not something that can be ignored, but in terms of how it's addressed, can make a great difference in terms of how the organization functions over time.
David, one of the questions that came in that I found myself having a lot of sympathy for was somebody who says, the board chair changes every 2 years. How do, and that's pretty challenging for an executive director who is expected to develop this trusting relationship, who is expected to inform the board chair of any and all challenges the organization is facing. I mean, what's your advice if you literally have this rapid turnover in the board chairmanship? What would be your advice to an executive director?
Well, I think that takes us into the broader area about term limits. I mean, my first question there would be why every 2 years? That I think I'm a believer in term limits, and the organization I'm working with now has term limits, and people are appointed to the board for 3 years. And at the end of that 3 years, they can ask to serve another 3 years at the pleasure of the rest of the board. At the end of the 6 years, it's mandatory that they leave the organization. And then after 3 years, again, they can come back on the organization if they choose to do so. But it gives the potential for a fairly long span for people on the board, but with the opportunity that's hardwired in this to have a new board that responds to new conditions. And I think that that's a healthy thing to do. So I guess the first question I would have is, why do you have a board chair who only has a 2-year term? Is that doing what you want to have done? And if that is the case, well, good luck. I mean, that you need to go through the same process every 2 years in terms of building this trust and understanding. And the reason that I put in the piece about being free to ask questions in any area is I think that's where the trust is built. It's not just around the organization itself. It's getting a really good understanding of who the person is and why they're doing what they're doing, why they joined the organization, what they value, what bothers them. I mean, one of the questions we had was, what's a good question that a board member can ask of an executive director? And I think it's the same sort of thing in terms of, what the board chair might ask of the executive director. My response is, what do you like about the job and what do you not like? And, how can we build on the things that where you get pleasure out of it? And how can we deal with the things that are really problematic? But Margo, you had a different response to that, which I thought was interesting. Well, probably maybe an elaboration on that.
Which was what?
Well, the whole question about, what a board member can ask that would be of help to an executive director.
Well, and I have to say, my daughter is the executive director of a nonprofit organization in the Boston area, and I asked her that question, and she said, "I would love it if board members asked me how could they help." board members have specific assignments, there's things that they do, but in her experience, the outreach is always on her side of the equation. So just, how can I help? Could be just a generous and encouraging question to for a board member or board chair to ask their executive director, just, out of the blue. I just want to, there's one question here that troubles me a bit. I did a fair amount of executive search work and worked with a lot of founding directors who were departing and assisting the board to hire their successor. And the question often came up, should we put our former executive director on the board? And I always advised against it. I think for a new executive director to not only follow in someone's shoes, but then to have those shoes under the board table can be challenging for all concerned. Somebody posed a question here saying, not only is the former executive director on their board, but is also chair of the board. I'm hoping that's an anomaly. That's not a case that happens often. I haven't seen that happen. I have seen boards put former executive directors on the board, but all I can say is it is a serious challenge, and developing with the executive committee and the executive director some boundaries about how this relationship could best work would be a very helpful thing. It's a challenge for the executive director. It may be a challenge for the former executive director as well, but if they can establish some boundaries and some understanding about what that this is a challenge and we need to figure a special way to deal with this challenge, I would suggest that might be helpful.
Hi, Margo and David. I'm just going to interrupt. There's a question that somebody posed that I think has got a couple of other attendees are interested in hearing, kind of follow up to what you're discussing. And it is, I would love to hear a little about succession planning for a board who does not seem to notice term limits nor build successors.
Want me to jump in first, or you want to say something, Dave?
Well, we're in the process of this right now, so
yeah.
I'll talk a little bit about it. Yeah, and I think succession planning is really critical, and needs to be thought about early and often. And it really gets to one of the core issues in terms of building a board from my perspective. And that's the whole question about who do you want on the board? What skills do you need on the board to be successful? And that changes over time. And so, every time there's an opportunity to add to the board, to change the composition of the board, that the full board needs to have the discussion about the skills that they currently have and the skills that are missing. And it can be an arduous process to find somebody to fill out the area that you think is missing on the board. And it can take time, and it's very important. And it's far more important to get people with both the skills and commitment, from my perspective, than just somebody who has a commitment but really doesn't have a particular skill or role to play on the board. And the problem with that is that you end up then with a board member who really doesn't have a job and doesn't have involvement. And that's not fulfilling to them, and can be difficult for the organization itself.
Just one other comment on the succession concept. When you add a board member, somebody else asked a question about who plays a role in recruiting the board. Is it the executive director? Is it the board chair? Is it typically, in my experience, it is a small group of board members who agree to sort of play that role. But as David said, figuring out what you need, doing a matrix that says this is what we have, not just this is what we needed 5 years ago, but this is what we are likely to need going forward, is a really valuable exercise. And to do that before you start throwing names around. And then, the question is, whose networks can produce the most likely candidates to fill this role? And how does what is the assessment of that person as a member of a board, not as an individual contributor, but as working with a board of directors? Because some people are cut out for that role, some people simply are not. Some people will be willing to play a role as an advisor to the board if they can't or won't be on the board, but they have a special skill the board needs. So thinking really creatively. And I don't think executive directors should choose who their board members are going to be. I think that's choosing your boss. But I do think the executive director probably has networks, probably understands the depths of the organization and organizational needs in a critical way, and they should certainly be a part of the process. And I have seen executive directors have tremendously valuable input as board members considered succession for the board.
I think extending that a little bit farther, Margo, and we can this will take us into another difficult area, I think, and that's that. I agree with everything that Margo said in terms of turning to the board members and finding out the groups that they can turn to. But there are also people in the community that you would love to have on the board and that you won't. Yeah. That they're already engaged in a lot of other boards, but there are people that you respect and people that you think have the skills that would be the skills that you most need on your board. And again, they're not available, but they can be available as advocates. And so going beyond the board to a whole group of advocates, of people who are in a particular skill area that you need, can be a very valuable way to proceed. And I think that also brings us into the question about diversity on the board and how you go about judging diversity, the need for it, and how you go about filling goals that you may have established in terms of a diverse board, whatever that may mean. Any thoughts about?
Well, I think you sort of said it. I mean, you may find people who you would love to have on your board, who are people of color, who are women, who are whatever it is that your board needs to make clear that that diversity is valued. And if the person that you're hoping for can't do it because of other obligations or whatever, asking them, who do they know? Explaining to them exactly what you're looking for and asking them, who do they know? And even in some cases, whether they will make a call for you to introduce you so you can follow up with a conversation with them. There are a lot of organizations whose membership really constitutes diversity. And I have found some great resources online, just as simple as typing in seeking diversity on our board. And there will be a number of suggestions of organizations and agencies that can provide some assistance. And I'm sure you all know Bridgeport and other of the more common resources. Advertising positions is also a really viable way to approach that.
And it can be a very lengthy process. As a real world example, I'm currently chair of the board of a library in the town in which I live. And the library is built upon an indigenous burial ground. And that has many implications for the institution and for the town and for the people associated with all of this. And that, of course, inevitably brings up the question about representation by the indigenous community on the board and with the board and in the activities. And of people who are in demand in terms of boards at this point, I would suspect that people from the indigenous community are pretty high on the list. And so there are very few people in your community, if that happens to be what you're looking for, that you're going to be able to go to bring onto your board. And in part because they're approached so often with questions like this or broader questions, and it just consumes an enormous amount of time. And that you really have to do something very different in dealing with these kinds of issues that has to do with a lot of outreach and a lot of listening. and really beginning to understand why people might do this, why they might not, what the implications are, what position more than anything else perhaps it puts them in by being associated with a particular organization. In order to answer those questions, you really have to understand your organization and you have to know how it's perceived. I think one of the best ways to get good, diverse representation on your board is to have a good board and have a good organization and being doing good works. If you can't answer those three questions in a positive manner, then what you're doing is not particularly helpful in trying to expand the diversity of the board at that point. So really, you have to look first to how your organization is functioning, what it can gain by a more diverse board, how it can see its mission more broadly, and how much time and effort it's willing to expend to be effective in that area.
And now the only thing I would add to that is, recruitment and engagement is the first thing. One of the things that I've seen, I did a recruitment for the executive director of a Boys and Girls Club, and it was a great board. Almost every one of them was an alumnus of that particular Boys and Girls Club. And they were very anxious to increase the diversity on their board. They particularly wanted people of color. I mean, they were very clear about that and very genuinely wanted that. We worked on it. Eventually, we recruited 3 people of color for their board. And what happened then, and these were 3 people who filled all the needs that they had in terms of professional skills, personal skills, ability to work in the context of a board. But what they didn't do was they didn't include these folks. They didn't create a sense of inclusion, a sense of belonging for these folks, because this board was kind of a group of folks who had known each other for a long, long time. And the 3 people that we hired, 2 of them drifted away relatively quickly. And anyway, so just remembering that you need to, and this is true for every board member, every new board member should have a buddy on the board, somebody who they can ask the questions that they're too reluctant or embarrassed to ask in person, etc. It could just thinking about yourself being brand new in a situation of people who've been in the role for a long time. What would help you to feel more comfortable, to feel more confident, and to know more about the organization than you might have known already? I just want to jump to this question, David, because this is a really important question. When an executive director hires someone on their staff who they see as their likely successor, or they hope to see the likely successor, if and when they leave, what obligation does the board have to hire that person as the new executive director? And I mean, you may have some thoughts about that. I would just jump in and say, be very transparent. I mean, if you think that this person is likely to be a successor, I would have that confidential conversation with the executive committee. Not that they must hire the board. Board's decision will be their decision, and no promises should be made to the person who you would like to see your successor, but give them exposure, give them opportunities to appear before the board, to present reports to the board. Think about how you get the board familiar with them so that when the time comes, the board will have a more reliable set of informations to make their final decision.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And it often emerges in terms of the relationship between the executive director and particular staff members. And as that evolves over time, and the executive director wants to promote a particular person or thinks that they would be a good successor, and it may very well be an appropriate choice, but it really, all of that needs to be made clear to the board chair and to the board in general, and why this relationship has evolved, what it means, what obligations may be implied under that. I mean, I think my simple answer to the question about, what responsibility does the board have to hire this chosen successor? The simple answer would be none. But it certainly is worthwhile, giving that person good consideration. But that's really something that has to be looked at fairly carefully. And also, we have to ask the question about why the executive director left. And, was it because they retired, because it was, at times I'm tempted to propose the idea of term limits for executive directors, which is not always a popular idea, but sometimes, somebody can just outstay their time in a position like that. And when they begin to line up their successor, it often means that that's something that they have in their mind, and it's something that should be discussed.
I'm just looking at this question here. What obligation does an executive director have to a board if they are going to leave and there is no logical successor in the organization? Does the executive director have an obligation to train the board on what needs to be done, or does the executive director have to train the new executive director? Well, complicated question, probably not a complicated answer. I mean, I think giving adequate notice to the board is really important. And, there's always the question of, do we hire an interim director or do we pursue a full search? And if the board has the opportunity to hire an interim director, in other words, you don't have unlimited finances, but if the executive director is leaving and there is the salary then available to hire an interim director to give the board the opportunity to really think things through and to pursue things in a really professional manner. There are organizations that do nothing but provide interim executive directors to nonprofit organizations. And sometimes that is the best and kindest and smartest answer, rather than when an executive director announces they're leaving, boards often go into full panic mode. They want to race to going into hiring right away. That can be a huge mistake. So if the board can be convinced to step back, to get somebody to serve an interim role so that they have the time and space to really think through, and an interim executive can help the board understand, the strengths and weaknesses of the organization in a way that was probably challenging for the former executive director. So it's just something worth thinking about. And does the leaving executive director have to train the new executive director? Not necessarily, and particularly not if you have an interim executive. So those are decisions that the board should consider all their options and which is best for the long-term health of the organization.
There's another question that I saw that came in previously, and that had to do with something I think probably most boards experience at one point or another, and that has to do with a board member, well, put simply, talks too much. And how does the board, well, the question was, how does the executive director deal with that? And I think it's probably more a question for the board chair, but it does bring up the question about how board meetings are organized, and the best way to have an efficient board meeting. And Margo, we talked a little bit about the way you classify information that goes to the board at a particular board meeting. You had slightly different terms than I was using, but why don't you talk about yours and then I'll.
Well, just really quickly, and I suspect it will be familiar to many of you, and that is what's called a consent agenda, which simply means that you have various topics on the agenda. Some of the topics are purely informational topics. There's nothing that needs to be discussed at this point. There's nothing that needs to be decided at this point, but the board may reasonably want sort of an update. Those go into part of the agenda called a consent agenda, and those items can be approved all at once without further discussion, unless a board member objects and says, no, this item I want to take off of the consent agenda. I want some discussion on it. But a consent agenda, if any of you know Bill Ryan at the Kennedy School, he's a big proponent of consent agendas because it moves board meetings more smoothly. And it makes really clear, these are topics for discussion. These are topics that are not ready for discussion or decision at this point. So it makes the agenda clearer to everyone who participates. David, yeah, you had a slightly different approach.
Yeah, I think it's the same general approach. We structure it a little bit differently, and it has to do with items for discussion and items for information. And just making it clear to people that some of the things, and organize your agenda this way, are just simply information about what's happened to the organization, progress that's been made, issues that have been confronted and so on. And the other is a broader question about, what direction are we going? How important is this particular issue? And I think one of the problems that we often run into, let me digress for a moment, that one of the things that often seems to occur in nonprofit boards is that you have a nonprofit director who is somebody who has learned to be a nonprofit director and is there because of their commitment to the work the organization is doing, and because of the experience that they've had in this whole field of service and so on. And then you have a board chair who comes out of the business world, who has a very different view of how an organization should be run and what the purposes might be. And you can run into this conflict between the idea of taking a broader view of things and the idea that the board meeting has to be over in an hour. And one of the questions we had was, what do you do with somebody who brings up questions that are off track? Well, I think there are two things. One, there needs to be some flexibility in the agenda to deal with that. And number two, sometimes the things that are mentioned that are off track can be some of the most important things that need to be dealt with. Sometimes the source of the problem is not what you think, and that having a broader discussion about that can be very important. So I think it's important to alert people in advance that, yeah, there's a time for the board meeting. It may go over, it may not adhere strictly to an agenda. That's sort of what I was talking about, is, in a sense, disregarding some of the structure in the Robert's Rules of Order and really getting to the point where, you can have these kinds of more far-reaching discussions at a time. And in the board meeting itself, a particular board meeting, it may not be appropriate, but it may be very clear that what's being raised is something that is very important. And we have a number of times just simply scheduled a separate meeting if people have that availability to focus exclusively on some of these off-subject issues that sometimes turn out to be some of the most important issues that you can deal with.
One thing I would add to that too, there are organizations, I've been a member of some, that have a board contract that when someone is asked to become a board member, they sign a contract about things that they agree to do in terms of serving on a committee, in terms of reading materials that are sent in advance of the meeting. Sometimes the distraction of the meeting can be because people didn't read the material that was sent to them, and so they're not prepared for the discussion at hand. So, and then board evaluation. If on an annual basis, the board does a simple, nothing complicated, but a simple evaluation of how they feel like they have contributed, what they would like to see the board do more of, do less of. You can get some good information from that process if it's anonymous, and you can give the board chair some ammunition to sit down and talk with a board member who is not reading the material before the meeting, and so they're asking questions that were answered substantively in the material that was sent, etc. So those are two things to consider. Some people say if I asked a prospective board member to sign a contract, they probably wouldn't agree to serve. I don't necessarily think that's true. What Bill Ryan says, who I quoted earlier, is the question that when he asked board members, what do you contribute? How do you feel about being a board member of this organization? He said 9 out of 10 say, I don't know exactly what my job is. So it's worth remembering that and finding ways to be helpful in explaining what the job is.
Yeah, I think, staying with the subject for a moment, that if something comes up in a board meeting that a board member feels strongly about, passionately about, and time concerns are the major concern, that it's very difficult for the board chair, even more difficult for the executive director, to shut that person down without the person really feeling, upset about what's happened, because it is, embarrassed, or it's just something that they feel strongly about. And I'm really going to take us off track here for a moment, but part of it has to do with, the recent involvement with the indigenous community and so on. And there are very different ways that different societies are dealing with conflict. And we've developed in most organizations like this, a sort of a corporate culture about how you do that. And you have a certain amount of time, people are, fed within that time, and, things, you have a list of things that have to be accomplished in 45 minutes or an hour, and there's a press on to do it. Indigenous communities historically have dealt with things like those conflicts very differently, and really have relied on something that they talk about as a talking circle. And this is showing up more and more in management discussions now too, but really where you just put people in a circle and give them an opportunity to talk about their concerns. And you do it sequentially around the circle. And so people can't talk across the circle, they can't interrupt, and somebody can talk as long as they want. And we've done some of that lately, and it's a very different dynamic. And one of the things that happens is that when somebody says something that somebody else finds interesting or controversial, inevitably you want to jump in and make a comment on it. And then, the conversation can go slightly awry because you've got different people with different opinions without the amount of time to really deal with that. If you're taking time going around a group like that, the thing that you hear that you really wanted to respond to when you heard it, by the time it gets to be your chance to talk, it may very well have been resolved, or you've forgotten about it, or it's something entirely, very different. But I think it's just worth thinking a little bit about your board meetings, how they're conducted, how people feel at the end of it. One of the things we do at the end of our board meeting is just say, how do you feel about the time you spent here? And just go around the room fairly quickly. Did we cover the things that we needed to cover? Are there things that we need to put on another agenda? Did anybody feel interrupted or suppressed in the conversation that we had? But those are important things to get to and get out of the way. And if you don't, it can certainly trip you up going forward.
There's a question here about how do you feel about time limits for board meetings? And you've addressed some of that. I think we may disagree on some of it. I pretty much feel like it's really important for people to know. And I think you said this, what the time expectation is. And you said, if it's going to go over because of interest in a topic that really feels germane and important, to schedule a separate meeting, which also makes a ton of sense. One of the just tactic that I've seen boards use that it seems to be really helpful. Very often there are board members who are, always going to talk more, and there are always board members who are going to sort of chime in less, which doesn't necessarily mean they have less to say, but sort of the concept of, agreeing at the beginning of the meeting that people are going to step up and step back. They're going to pay attention to who may have concerns, who isn't necessarily as comfortable expressing them as they are. And the other concept is at the very end of the meeting, taking the last 2 minutes and actually asking each board member to write down the one question that they would like to have had a chance to ask, or the one comment that they would like to have had a chance to make at the meeting. Can sometimes bring some closure to people who may feel a little frustrated at a meeting that is ending precipitously from their point of view.
Yeah, maybe this is an area where we disagree a little bit.
Okay.
And it's around the concept of efficiency. And it's important, and you don't want to waste people's time, and you do want to get things accomplished. But I do often worry about what we leave on the table when we put too much emphasis upon the idea of being concise and efficient. And that I think if you can get to a point where you have board members who are sufficiently committed to the organization, that they're willing to spend the time and are willing to be a little bit more flexible and a little less efficient, I think ultimate efficiency often comes out of gross inefficiency. And that learning how to deal creatively with the idea of inefficiency and still being able to engage people and keep their involvement is a difficult balance. And I just think that many times the emphasis falls on the side of efficiency because that's our nature at this point. That's the nature of our culture. It's built upon the concept of efficiency. But long-term solutions often don't come out of that. And getting board members to understand that and work in an environment where that's not the goal may be more useful in the long term.
So
I just want to kind of interrupt right there. We've got actually nine minutes until the hour. I want to make sure that everyone's questions are addressed. Earlier, Wesley had asked, in terms of diversity of the board, should one skill set be prioritized over demographics, age, race, etc.?
I was going to say, if you believe, as I strongly do, that diversity is a huge asset and the absence of it is a deficit, then I would say you focus on, and you don't ignore the other things at all, but you just focus on not just the diversity side of it, but what else is this person bringing, or these people bringing that are fit into the matrix of things that the board needs. But I do feel like I feel like the absence of diversity isn't the challenge of that isn't fully appreciated until you actually have diversity on the board and you recognize what you were missing. So I opt for that every time.
Yeah, we may be split on this a little bit, not much. I mean, I agree with what Margo has said, and I think it should be obvious to everybody at this point that overemphasizing diversity per se can be insulting to a lot of people.
That is true.
And that although there's an enormous value, you can really make a situation much worse by not recognizing the skills that people have and making it clear that that is a reason that for their involvement. It's this line between inclusion and being condescending, and it's not an easy question for boards. And I think getting back to what we were talking about earlier, you really have to put the work into it. You really have to talk to a lot of people and find out what their interests are and find this group of advocates that can help you fill the position that's both diverse and has a role on the board other than just pure diversity. And if you can find that and people get a chance to demonstrate their skills, to be a part of the organization in that sort of way, and still bring their unique attitudes and experiences to the board, you're in a much stronger position.
Are there other questions, Dora, that you've noted?
Yes, Christina has asked, can you speak to what a board would like to hear from the ED about on a regular basis, finances aside?
Finances aside.
I'm sorry,
What would the board like to hear from the executive director on a regular basis, not including finances? Finances are a given. What else?
Well, I guess, just how are we doing? That you need to keep going back to your mission and goals and making people aware on an ongoing basis about why you have those, why they're important, and what you're doing to achieve that. So, as part of the board meeting, it's not just a matter of talking about all the things on the agenda and so on, as we're just mentioning, but it's also, it's harking back to what's the nature of the organization, what's the purpose of the organization, and making sure that people leave the meeting understanding that by coming to that meeting, that particular time, they advance the goals of the organization. And it's not a terribly difficult thing to do, but it's not always obvious. And you don't want people walking away saying, we spent the time, we had some good discussion, but what does this have to do with what it is that we're supposed to be doing? So I think, making that clear to people as often as you can, how this ties in. It also brings up the question about whether or not your goals and mission are still the appropriate ones. And if things change, that you really need to start thinking differently about it. And if you can't answer those questions in that sort of way, then maybe you really need to step back and ask about the purpose of the organization and its goals at that point in time.
And the only add to that is the concept of dashboards. I don't know if any of you use them. I'm sure some of you must, but when you have a program that is an ongoing program that the board has approved, that the board has supported, but that they kind of like to hear about it from time to time, rather than giving sort of a detailed report or a detailed written report before the board meeting, just providing a copy of a dashboard that is red light, green light, yellow light, with red meaning we're behind, green meaning we're doing fine, and yellow meaning there's some things that are in our way, maybe some of which need to be talked about. So
Ellen's asked, or just noted, getting back to something you mentioned earlier, I do think a lot of board members don't really know what they're supposed to do, including the chair. How does one address that problem? Does the ED step in and make recommendations? Does the ED ask the board chair to create more structure?
that's you, David, board chair.
Well, you've got a problem with it if no one on the board nor the board chair knows what they're supposed to do.
I would do nothing.
I'm not exactly sure where you go from there, but again, it all takes you back to the organization, the nature of the organization, and you really have to have a thorough understanding of that, and then have the discussion about how you're going to achieve these goals and what tasks need to be done, and then if the board hasn't been organized in that way, then you've got the difficult task in front of you of going through those and trying to find out if there are people on the board who really do have those skills that are needed. And if not, what are they adding to the board at that point? And at that point, if your bylaws allow for it, you probably should expand the board to bring more people on. People who don't think they have particular skills can learn from others if you have them on the board. If you have a whole board of people, I mean, this happens with appointed boards. And I don't know about people's experience here, but I've worked with boards where a good percentage of the board is appointed by the municipal government or something like that, or comes through election. And they're there for a whole set of different reasons. And my answer to that is don't let it happen. That you need to get to the appointing body with your program and get them to understand who you need on the board, rather than them just picking somebody that has been bothering them on different areas and you get rid of them to put them on your board. So it's, really, you have to figure out what the sources of your board members may be. And if you don't have direct control over that, you need to find a way to get as much as you can. Because there are people who are put on boards to simply destroy the board. And it's been clear from the beginning, that's why they're there, or they're there to get the executive director. And you need to know about that.
All right, we're coming up on our last minute. I just want to thank everyone for attending. If there's any additional questions, I don't know if David and Margo can stay on just a few more minutes, or do you have the time to answer any questions people might have?
After going on about the need for flexibility in agendas, I'd have to say yes.
This former CEO would have to say, not a chance. No, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. We definitely can. If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand now, or use the icon, and so we'll know that there is reason to stick around for a minute.
In answer, someone asked about receiving the recording. It'll be available on our website and also our YouTube channel. I want to thank everyone for attending. We hope this seminar was helpful. We really want to express our gratitude to David Parish and Margo Kelly. And just to let you know, our next event will be Tuesday, February 13th. And now the topic is From Concept to Implementation, Everyday Inclusive and and equitable actions. Thank you very much. And please fill out our survey that you'll receive a link to and an email that you will be sent.
And thank you
Thank
for the opportunity.
Yes, thanks, Dora, too, for your help.
Yeah. Well,
Additional questions, anyone?
It doesn't seem so.
Like you're still here?
I think we're good. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dora.
All right, thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.